The greatest defeat in modern British military history did not look like one. In fact, it looked like a miracle. Soldiers sang as they boarded the boats. Churchill called it deliverance. And to the average man on the street, Dunkirk became a tale of courage, tenacity, and national salvation. But to others especially, the men in German uniforms watching helplessly from the dune sit was something else entirely. A blunder, a failure, a betrayal. Why did Hitler halt his tanks when the enemy was cornered? Why did the Luftwaffe falter in its finest hour? And above all, what if they had not? This is the story of Dunkirk. Not the one told through speeches and wartime posters, but the one buried beneath bomb craters and the silence of the Channel. A story of men, mistakes, and the terrifying price of hesitation. And a question that still haunts us today. What was truly lost at Dunkirk? The spring of 1940 arrived not with the thunder of Allied guns, but with eerie quiet. For 7 long months after the declaration of war, Europe waited. It was a strange kind of war what the press called the Sitzkrieg, or the phony war. Armies sat still, borders remained unbreached, and the world watched with a breath held too long. Then came May. With shocking speed, Hitler's Wehrmacht struck west. The plan crafted by the cunning general Erich von Manstein was daring and devastating. It bypassed the mighty Maginot Line by sweeping through the Ardennes forest, a route deemed impassable by most French generals. But the Germans believed otherwise. Like a knife through soft linen, panzer divisions led by men like Heinz Guderian and Erwin Rommel sliced into the heart of Belgium and northern France. Fortresses crumbled, defenses shattered. The Blitzkrieg lightning war had arrived. In just days, the Germans achieved what the Kaiser had failed to do in 4 years during the Great War. The French line broke, and the Allied forces, primarily the British Expeditionary Force and French First Army, were suddenly trapped. Behind them, the sea. In front of them, a steel tide that showed no signs of stopping. By May 20, German armor had reached the English Channel at Abbeville, cutting off hundreds of thousands of troops in northern France and Belgium. It was a trap, the perfect encirclement. And yet, the jaws never fully closed. On May 24, with victory within reach, the tanks stopped. Historians still argue why. Some say it was Hitler himself, fearful of committing his precious panzer divisions to the marshy terrain of Flanders. Others point fingers at Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, who promised to annihilate the trapped armies from the air. Still, others blame the cautious high command, worried about overextending already strained supply lines. Whatever the reason, the order came. The panzer spearheads halted just miles from Dunkirk. For 48 crucial hours, German armor stood still watching, waiting. And across the Channel, the British moved. Operation Dynamo began on May 26, coordinated from a secret command center beneath Dover Castle. Its goal was simple: to evacuate as many troops as possible from the beaches of Dunkirk. But it was also absurd. The Royal Navy didn't have enough warships to carry home 300,000 men, so they turned to civilians. Fishing trawlers, river barges, pleasure yachts, lifeboats. Some were commandeered, others were volunteered. And soon, an unlikely armada began crossing the Channel flotilla of civilians steering into a war zone. It should have failed. The harbor was destroyed. The beaches were open. Luftwaffe bombers rained fire. And yet, they came, over and over again. By nightfall, the impossible began to look inevitable. To the Germans, Dunkirk was not an escape. It was a shooting gallery. As the evacuation began in earnest, the Luftwaffe struck with fury. Heinkel, He 111s, Junkers, Ju 87, Stukas, and Dornier bombers roared through the skies, their engines a constant drone over the beaches. From above, British soldiers appeared as little black dots scrambling across the white sand. It was like shooting ants with a magnifying glass, one pilot recalled. But for all Göring's boasts, the Luftwaffe faltered. The skies above Dunkirk were a nightmare for aircraft. Cloud banks clung low to the coastline, masking targets and ruining visibility. Thick smoke from burning ships and oil tanks obscured the beach. German pilots, who had enjoyed near total dominance over France, now found themselves in long-range engagements, flying at the edge of their fuel reserves. Fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 were superb machines, but they were short-legged. By the time they reached Dunkirk, they had little time to engage before having to return. In contrast, British Spitfires and Hurricanes were operating from airfields just across the channel. They could loiter longer, hit harder, and return quicker. RAF Fighter Command, under the direction of Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, had made the difficult decision to commit its precious few squadrons to the fight. Though outnumbered, they fought with surgical precision, defending the evacuation corridor and intercepting Luftwaffe raids. For the first time in the war, Goering's pilots met a match. Still, the bombing continued. On May 29, the destroyer HMS Grenade was hit in Dunkirk harbor and exploded in a ball of flame. That same day, German bombs struck the oil tanks near the jetty, creating an inferno that turned night into day. Bodies floated in the surf, burned-out hulls littered the shore, and yet the evacuation continued. At its peak, one boat was leaving every 3 minutes. On the beaches, the scene was surreal. Tens of thousands of men lined up in long, disciplined columns stretching across the sand. They had little shelter, less food, and no guarantee of rescue. But order held. In the face of death, the British soldier stood. Some took turns burying the dead. Others played cards. One man spent 2 days in the surf, up to his waist in cold seawater, waiting for a boat. He never let go of his rifle. There were moments of chaos. Panic gripped some when ships were struck. Small boats capsized under the weight of desperate troops. And always, the Stukas returned howling as they dove, their sirens screaming a death wail. Each pass sent men scattering. Each bomb gouged new craters in the sand. But discipline held. French soldiers defended the perimeter with heroism that earned the respect of even their British comrades. Outside the city of Lille, a rearguard of over 40,000 French troops fought to the last bullet, buying time for the evacuation to continue. Encircled, starved, and bombed, they refused to yield. Their stand tied up nearly 7 German divisions. Churchill, watching from London, understood the moment's gravity. He knew victory was no longer possible, but survival was. On the 4th of June, as the final boats pulled away, he addressed Parliament in words that would echo across time. "We shall not flag or fail. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds." The numbers defied belief. Over 9 days, 338,226 Allied soldiers had been rescued. More than 700 civilian vessels had crossed the Channel multiple times. Nearly all had come under fire. But the cost was heavy. The British left behind over 24,000 vehicles, 2,700 artillery pieces, and countless tons of ammunition and fuel. Entire units had abandoned everything. The Royal Army was intact, but naked. It would take years to rearm. And the French? Their fate was darker. Only about 1/3 of the French soldiers trapped at Dunkirk were evacuated. The rest over 40,000 men were captured and marched into captivity. Some were executed on the spot. German morale soared. Propaganda celebrated the victory at Dunkirk. Posters showed wrecked British trucks and burnt-out tanks. Speeches in Berlin proclaimed the end of British power on the continent. But privately, many German commanders were furious. To them, Dunkirk was not a triumph, it was a lost opportunity. General Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of Army Group A, was livid. He believed the halt order had cost Germany the chance to destroy the entire British Expeditionary Force. General Heinz Guderian was even more blunt. Dunkirk was a major mistake. And Hitler? He remained eerily calm. When questioned about the decision to stop the tanks, he reportedly shrugged and said, "The British won't come back." He was wrong. In the weeks that followed Dunkirk, Hitler stood at the height of his power. Paris fell on the 14th of June. France capitulated 11 days later. Mussolini joined the war to share in the spoils. The swastika now flew over every capital in Western Europe save London. And yet Dunkirk remained a wound, a stain. The Germans had won the field, but they had failed to destroy the soul. Winston Churchill called it a miracle of deliverance. British morale, instead of collapsing, hardened. From the ashes of retreat, the myth of Dunkirk was born, not a story of defeat, but of defiance. A people rallied around the image of little ships braving the bombs, of fishermen towing gunboats, of schoolboys and farmers crossing the channel into hell, then returning with a ship full of survivors. Propaganda weaponized the moment. Newsreels showed smiling Tommies disembarking in Dover, waving to crowds. Stories of valor and sacrifice spread like wildfire. One photograph of a young soldier carrying his wounded friend through the surf was reprinted on every front page. It became a symbol of British grit, but beneath the triumphalism lay a deeper truth the German high command missed entirely. Britain had lost its weapons, but kept its men. This mattered more than Hitler knew, for men could be retrained, rearmed, redeployed. Had the British army been captured en masse, there may have been no army left to fight in North Africa. No soldiers to land at Normandy, no spearhead to liberate Europe. Instead, Britain emerged wounded but alive. And so we return to the central riddle. Why did Hitler stop the tanks? Some historians argue it was strategic. Hitler feared the Panzers would get bogged down in the Flanders marshes, just as they had in World War I. Others suggest he wanted to preserve his strength for the coming push into southern France. Still others point to political calculation. Hitler believed Britain might yet sue for peace. He had no desire to destroy the British Empirate, least not yet. In his twisted vision, the British were Aryan cousins. He imagined a future where Germany dominated Europe while Britain kept its colonial empire, both cooperating against the Soviets. Destroying the BEF might force Churchill into a fight he didn't want. And then there is Goering, the ever-ambitious, ever-insecure commander of the Luftwaffe. Goering promised Hitler that his air force alone could finish the job, that the Luftwaffe would trap the British on the beaches and annihilate them from above. He wanted to prove the supremacy of air power. He also wanted glory. Hitler gave him his chance. It was a mistake. And though Hitler later claimed he was saving the British as an act of mercy, few in Berlin truly believed it. As the war dragged on, many generals came to view Dunkirk as the moment when victory slipped through their fingers. Dunkirk left scars on all who passed through it. The beaches, once calm and serene, had become cemeteries. Shell casings littered the sand for months. Burned-out wrecks dotted the coastline. Fishermen trawled up rusted rifles and boot soles years after the last shot was fired. But it also left a memory, a myth. To the British, Dunkirk became more than a battle, it became a national ethos. The Dunkirk spirit stood for resilience, for unity in the face of disaster. It was invoked during the Blitz, during rationing, during the worst days of 1940, when invasion. Today, the sands of Dunkirk are clean. Children play where once men died. Tourists walk the seawall, reading plaques and taking photos. The town is rebuilt. The scars are hidden. But they are not gone. In the surf, divers still find wreckage-y engine block here, a rusted helmet there. In the dunes, metal detectors click over buried remnants of war. Beneath every step lies a trace of history. And in the minds of historians, Dunkirk remains unresolved. A miracle? A blunder? A tragedy delayed? No consensus exists. Perhaps there never will be. But this much is certain: Dunkirk was not the end. It was the beginning of a longer, bloodier, more uncertain war. A war that would stretch across continents and consume millions. A war that would not be decided by tanks alone, but by resilience, by morale, by will. In those days of May and June 1940, it seemed Europe might fall. But on a narrow strip of French beach, history held its breath and decided otherwise. So the question remains, was Dunkirk a miracle or a warning? The immediate success of the evacuation was quantifiable, over 338,000 men rescued. But Dunkirk's true impact echoed far beyond the beachhead. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched closely. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, still publicly committed to neutrality, recognized that Britain's survival was no longer a long-shot fantasy. Public opinion, though wary of war, began to shift. Sympathy became support, and soon, support would become action. Within months, the Lend-Lease Act would pass. American factories began supplying Britain with tanks, trucks, rifles, and rations. The arsenal of democracy had opened its doors. And Dunkirk was the catalyst. As one member of Congress reportedly said, "We help them fight there, or we fight here later." In Germany, the mood was less reflective, at least on the surface. Newsreels showed endless columns of British equipment seized on the beaches. Goebbels' propaganda ministry painted the evacuation as a pathetic retreat. But in private, concern was growing. The British were still in the war, and with them, hope for a second front. Even in neutral Spain, Portugal, Sweden, Dunkirk sent a signal. The Allies were wounded but not beaten. This would not be another 1,871, another swift, humiliating collapse. And for occupied peoples from Paris to Prague to Warsaw, Dunkirk became a whisper, a spark, a sign that resistance was not futile. If the Panzers were the face of terror, then the little ships were the face of quiet bravery. Nearly 900 vessels took part in the evacuation, many crewed by civilians. Thames, barges, fishing trawlers, lifeboats, pleasure cruisers, ferries. Some had radios, others didn't. Some were armored, most weren't. Many had never crossed the channel before, and yet they sailed. They braved Luftwaffe bombs, minefields, and the jagged wreckage of war to reach the beaches. Some made a single crossing. Others went back again and again. One boat, the Sundowner, was skippered by Charles Lyttelurtha, senior surviving officer from the Titanic. He packed 130 men into a yacht designed for 20. Stories like these became legends. There was Tamzine, a fishing boat just 14 feet long, the smallest vessel in the flotilla. There were tugboats, towing barges filled with troops, fireboats ferrying wounded. An entire generation of ordinary Britons defying the storm. Many never returned, but their sacrifice was not forgotten. In 1965, on the 25th anniversary of the evacuation, surviving little ships reenacted the voyage, sailing once more across the channel. The tradition continues to this day. Speculation in hindsight can be dangerous, but the question refuses to die. Could Germany have won the war at Dunkirk? In purely military terms, perhaps yes. If the Panzers had pressed the advantage, if the Luftwaffe had better weather, if Hitler had not hesitated, if Goering had not overpromised. But wars are not won with ifs. Some analysts argue that capturing the BEF would not have forced British surrender, that Churchill, stubborn as he was, would have fought on regardless, that the Royal Navy, the Home Guard, and the Empire would have resisted to the bitter end, that the invasion of Britain Operation Sea Lion was always doomed to fail. Others disagree. They point out how fragile British morale truly was in 1940. The Luftwaffe's bombs had yet to fall on London. America had yet to enter the war. Stalin was still Hitler's uneasy partner, and Churchill's position was far from secure. A crushing defeat at Dunkirk might have empowered the peace faction within his own cabinet, might have forced a deal, might have changed everything. We will never know. But the what-ifs remain. A reminder that in war, the line between catastrophe and miracle is thinner than we like to admit. Dunkirk was not the most violent battle of World War II, not the bloodiest, not even the most strategically important by some measures, but it was the most pivotal, because it kept hope alive, because it proved that courage could defy steel, that resolve could defy strategy, that a people, united by desperation, could still write history with broken hands, and because in saving an army, it saved a future. The men who returned from Dunkirk would fight again in North Africa, in Sicily, in Normandy. They would cross deserts and mountains, rivers and beaches. They would help liberate France, crush the Reich, and end the nightmare. But it began here, in the fog, in the fire, on a narrow strip of sand beneath the falling bombs. where history hesitated and chose to endure. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to subscribe to Legacy Files, where history isn't just told, it's remembered. It became part of the soul of the nation. For the Germans, it was a moment of hubris. The war that had begun with such shocking victories. Poland, Norway, France now bore its first shadow of doubt. The British had escaped. The war would not be over by Christmas. Hitler would never again have such an opportunity.